I would say, because we've been talking to a lot of other researchers here on the show, and we've talked to people who don't believe that grammar can be explicitly taught. We have talked to people that implicit knowledge cannot be transformed into explicit knowledge. So I feel like there are a lot of areas that we want to cover. But I think you both said something interesting, which is to know the grammar of a second language. How can we perhaps define this grammatical knowledge that a person has, specifically for a lot of language teachers who teach languages more explicitly and believe that you can actually acquire this grammar explicitly? So, to both of you, what is the best way for us to define this grammatical knowledge, specifically in the context of language acquisition and development?
So, how can are you talking about the interlanguage system that the second language learners develop?
Yeah, that's one
Yeah.
of them. But
No, because so all we can do, so we know how language learning happens. We have some, we believe, innate linguistic capacities that allow
Mhm,
us to parse the input. All we can do is provide input, right? In
mhm,
the form of either conversations, what we called primary linguistic data, or we called positive evidence,
mhm,
or you can be in a classroom situation where you are talking about also explicit rules of the grammar, but all that is input.
mhm,
So what the learner gets out of that, that's very implicit, right? And that's in a way what we're trying to understand, but we cannot open somebody's head to know what's going on. So we can only do that through tasks, through oral production, through psycholinguistic experiments. But, along the way, as second language learners interact with the input in the second language, that is also filtered through or together with their linguistic knowledge of their first language.
mm,
So they construct this system that, with more input and more input, be it explicit or implicit, moves them closer to the grammar of a native speaker. Or, advanced proficiency learners, you know approximate native speakers more than beginners.
Yeah. If I may add to that, we both work within the linguistic tradition where what we mean by grammar isn't what a textbook says grammar is, but rather it's the set of rules within somebody's head that allows them to produce and understand sentences of a given language. So all of us have at least one native language, some have more than
mhm,
one. And even very young children or individuals who've never been to school, who've never explicitly thought about language or explicitly studied grammar, nevertheless have a mental grammar of their native language. But with the second language, most people, at least in this country, learn the second language through at least some involvement of the classroom textbooks,
mhm.
explicit instruction. So one of the interesting questions in our field is, how do these two systems interact? I think
Right.
is what you were referring to earlier in terms of what people debate about. Can explicitly telling somebody about grammatical rules lead them to internalize those rules and make changes to their mental grammar for their
Dollar question, because
Mm-hmm.
there are many different people with very different positions on whether or not this explicit knowledge of
Mhm.
language can actually be converted into implicit knowledge. Where do you both stand on this? Is it possible for this explicit knowledge, based on all the research that you have been doing with intervention research, which we will
Mm-hmm.
talk about later on? But where do you stand on this
Mm-hmm.
dichotomy, explicit, implicit?
For me, I would say this is an empirical question that requires an empirical answer. In a sense, I would say that's one of the reasons we wrote this book, to really get a lot of this information together. What do we actually know about the interaction between different types of instruction and what learners ultimately gain? I would say, based on research today, I definitely think it's possible for instruction to affect learners' grammatical knowledge. The precise conditions under which it's most effective, I feel we still need to learn. We still have a lot to learn. We still need to do a lot of research to really determine what kind of instruction is most effective for what kind of knowledge. What does it take to bridge the implicit explicit divide? But I would say there is enough evidence that it's certainly possible.
If I may add to that, so you people are, or we are talking about implicit and explicit knowledge as if it were something that only second language learners experience.
Mm-hmm.
But native speakers of a language also possess both types of knowledge. When a child learning their first language are implicit learners until they are 4 or 5 years of age. Language happens to children, language emerges. I think nobody will dispute that. Children can use nouns, verbs, adjectives in the correct positions. Yeah, they make some errors, but they go away. Never having heard of what an infinitive is, or what a preposition is, or what a transitive verb is, or what a passive voice is, but they can do it. When children go to school at age 4 or 5, they develop, this is a cognitive development, it's a metalinguistic awareness. This is a precursor for learning to read and write. When children begin to learn to read and write, now they start to focus on the form of language. This is the beginning of explicit knowledge, so if you compare native speakers who are educated versus illiterate native speakers, we will have the same kind of questions.
Right.
Can we say that things that you have learned through reading and writing at school become part of your implicit linguistic knowledge? Or no, these are two types of knowledge that are completely separate in your mind, and they don't relate to each other. So we also need to do research on the monolingual speakers to see what is the impact of written language on linguistic development in general. And of course, we see it very clearly in the second language acquisition situation, and even more clearly in the heritage speakers, which we also discuss in the book, because these are native speakers, bilingual native speakers, who learn their heritage language primarily, or through the oral medium, and I have lots of studies showing that they have highly implicit knowledge of the heritage language. But when you give them tests that are very explicit, or you put them in explicit language situation, they don't know what to do. So this is a clear case where you can see this type of knowledge in native speakers, because that's the way the language developed. And so comparing these two groups, for me, I mean, I've been doing this for many years, has answered a little bit of those questions, to say that a lot of the experience that the second language learner gets is explicit in the classroom. So that kind of promotes the explicit system, but that doesn't mean that I think that eventually the explicit system can seep into the implicit system. But again, if you think about native speakers, we have the same type of relationship between these two types of linguistic knowledge.
I'm actually living that right now. I'm teaching a communications class at a post-secondary level to what we might call local Canadian students. And it's very much this relationship that you point out, Silvina, between knowledge of the language versus knowledge about the language, right? And they seem to really struggle with that. So I'm thinking of things like punctuation across compound and complex sentences, for example, and which adverbs require, or which conjunctions require which punctuation, and so on. And I'm kind of seeing that as coming from a language teaching background now in this kind of English medium course that I'm teaching. And it's really interesting to see these dynamics emerge.
As teachers, this is like our language, to talk about metalinguistic concepts. We don't think about it. They are natural for us, but for many native speakers, when you add this metalinguistic knowledge, it's a different type of knowledge, and it could be challenging.